everyone. Welcome. My name is Ayan Jama. I am the acting manager for diversity and inclusion at the University Student Union. Welcome to today's program, Moving Forward Together, Steps Towards Unlearning Colonial Ideologies in Higher Education. This program is a collaboration program with University Student Union, USU Dream Center, the Asian American Studies Pathway Project, American Indian Studies, Civil Discourse and Social Change, Department of Social Work, Doctoral Program in Educational Leadership, Ethnic Studies, Educational Pathways, Mentoring to Overcome Struggles and Inspire Courage, Project Rebound, as well as We Are Power, Community in Action and Conference. We appreciate you all for being here today and joining us for this program. Before we get started, we're gonna go ahead and I'm gonna go ahead and do a land acknowledgement. We want to start today's program by respecting and acknowledging the land in which we currently reside. We know land acknowledgements are used by Native people and non-Native people to recognize Indigenous peoples who are original stewards of the land in which we now live. California University Northridge recognizes and acknowledges the Sasavitan, the first people of this ancestral unceded territory of Sasavenga that is now occupied by our institution, and it honors their elders past and present and the Sasavitan descendants who are citizens of Fernandinho Tatavian Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that the Sasavitans are still here, and we are committed to uplifting their stories, culture, community. Consistent with our CSUN values of respecting all people and our alliance with the community, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native people. By offering these land acknowledgements, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty. We will work to uphold. And I'm going to go ahead and share a quick link for more information about land acknowledgement importance and so on in the chat. Today's program, we're so excited to have you, so I am going to go ahead and introduce today's moderator, Dr. Marta Escobar. Dr. Marta Escobar is a professor at the Chicano and Chicano Studies Department. She received her doctoral degree in ethnic studies from the University of California, San Diego, and is the author of the book Captivity Beyond Prisons, Criminalization Experience of Latina Immigrants. Professor Escobar is the executive director for Project Rebound, a campus resource dedicated to supporting formerly incarcerated students. She serves as the chair of the Educational Equity Committee, which is a part of the Faculty Senate and charged with examining educational equity on campus, and an advisory board member for the Center for Study of the People of Americas, CIESPA, and a member of Civil Discourse and Social Change, a campus-wide initiative that promotes social justice at CSUN and beyond. I am going to go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Marta Escobar.
Thank you so much, Ayan. Thank you, everybody, for being here. To the USU folks, the organizers, for inviting me to moderate this event, Moving Forward Together, Steps Towards Unlearning Colonial Ideologies in Higher Education. So when I was first invited, my first instinct was to say no, because I'm like, turn it over to folks, Indigenous folks on campus, right? That should be guiding these conversations. And then when I was told that folks had already been invited on the panel, I'm like, okay, I'm excited. And then I saw the complete list of panelists and I was even happier, right? Because it's so rare when you get to have an opportunity to sit down with folks that you really like and that are amazing human beings to have this kind of conversation, right? So this is an opportunity for the collective to think about how colonization structured our lives, including CSUN, to consider the necessary work that needs to be done to undo these systems of power, challenge. And I'm especially grateful that we are taking time to engage in a feminist ethics of self-reflexivity, right? Where it demands to have this conversation, it demands that we ask these questions. How are we complicit in relationships of power? How does higher education reproduce colonial legacies and practices? Why and how do we do this work? Who is this work for? How are the most impacted centered in our work? And are we being radical? By which it just means, are we getting to the root cause of whatever problems we're trying to address, right? So this is an opportunity for us to think about some of these questions and then really about the meaning of our work, right? What are we trying to do at CSUN and in higher education? So thank you so much for that. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists. First, we have Dr. Tina Bayena, pronouns she, her, hers. She's an assistant professor of gender and women's studies at CSUN. She's an interdisciplinary scholar with interest in gender-based violence in conflict zones, post-colonial, decolonial, and transnational feminisms, and critical development studies. Her work focuses on the colonial underpinnings of the mass rape in African conflict zones, especially in the wars in the African Great Lakes region, grassroots feminist organizing and state repression in Ethiopia, and gender and STEM in the developing world. Her courses include feminist theories, feminist research methods, women as agents of change, and in the spring 2021, for any undergrads out there, she's going to be teaching gender, human rights, and conflict zones for next semester. Prior to academia, she worked in publishing with the focus on topics in feminism, anti-racism, anti-militarism, and environmental justice globally. Thank you so much, Dr. Bayena. Our second panelist is Dr. Tracy La Chica Buenavista. I love La Chica. Pronouns she, her, hers, Isuna. She's a professor in Asian American Studies and a core faculty member of the doctoral program in educational leadership at CSUN. While on campus, she has helped establish the Dream Center, Asian American Studies Pathways Project, and the Ethnic Studies Education Pathways Project. And she serves as a community advisory council for Project Rebound. And I see a couple of our students here, so that added a little bit of stress and anxiety, but I'm so glad you're here. In her research, she utilizes critical race theory to examine how race, immigration, and carcerality shape the educational access, retention, and experiences of BIPOC students and educators. She has published various articles and book chapters on these topics and co-edited 4 books, including Education at War, Whitewashing in American Education, and the forthcoming First Generation Faculty of Color Narratives. We also have Dr. Jose Miguel Baez, pronouns he, him, his. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Social Work. He first joined CSUN in the fall of 2009 as a full-time lecturer. He received his master's degree from social work at the University of Southern California in 2001, with an emphasis on children and families. He earned his degree from CSUN in his doctoral degree in education from CSUN in 2020. Dr. Baez has a background in theater, improv, spoken word, and was also a basketball coach at various levels for over 10 years. I know we've worked together for the longest time, and I'm like, did I know that about Jose? And finally, Dr. Nicole Blalock, pronouns she, her, hers, Crow, Cherokee, and Chickasaw descendant, settler Danish, and settler English. She's a first-generation professor of American Indian Studies who grew up in Cow Creek, Umpqua, Tolowa, Ni, and Tutuni homelands. She focuses on access, retention, and success in education, healing from intergenerational trauma, and decolonial and artivist programming and scholarship. In addition to her partnerships in Indigenous communities, she previously worked as a teacher in a school embedded in a juvenile incarceration facility with students 8 to 18 years of age. She loves to nurture and share food and plant medicines with her partner, extended family, and community. So thank you to everyone, to the panelists, and to everyone for being here. The panelists have prepared presentations which will be followed by a moderated conversation, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, and then we'll close with some spoken word. So if it's okay with everybody, let's turn everything over to Dr. Tina Bayena.
Thank you, Marta. Can you hear me? Okay, so I'm just gonna stick to the questions that were posed to me and start there. And I think the first question that came to me was about the benefits of unlearning colonial ideologies in and outside of the classroom. So I just jotted down some notes, but first of all, in order to just really even begin to unlearn colonial ideologies, we have to understand what it is. And there are many forms of colonial formations, and they haven't all had the same impact. But in all instances, I like the definition that Anya Lumba gives, which is that colonialism draws inhabitants into this complicated and violent relationship with conquering people. And it also leads to the massive movement of populations and natural and military resources, and it restructures economies and cultures profoundly, but with conquerors being the beneficiaries. And there are many, many kinds of colonial forms throughout history. We have, in the ancient world, we have the Roman and Aksum Empire, and we have, in the more recent history, we have Mughal Empire and the Ottoman empires, which are all forms of colonial formations. But after the 1600s, really, the most salient and probably the most visible and powerful form was the European domination of what Vijay Prashad has called the darker nations, right? So by 1930s, over 80% of the world was under colonial rule of some kind. And consequently, the entire globe was drawn into this economic, global economic system that we haven't escaped. Western nations have continued to amass wealth and power while the developing world has been exploited and underdeveloped. Colonial ideologies have also left us with a legacy of differentiating our society by race and gender and class. And when we think, which we then think tell us something about the superior and inferior nature of groups of people. And this binary and oppositional thinking permeates our contemporary moment. We have racial binaries and gender binaries and sexual binaries and so on. So if you don't know colonial history, you really won't know how our contemporary trade, military, environmental policies are built on these colonial ideologies that naturalize racial and gender oppositional thinking. And you won't know how colonial dynamics drive our political and educational institutions, or how they condition our consumption habits, our domestic spaces and neighborhood segregation, or what dominant images we see in media. And with the current number of crises that's facing the generation of students that we're teaching, global food shortage, water crisis, energy crisis, and so on, I really don't think it's a choice for students to leave college without knowing one of the most instrumental sources of these crises, which is colonial rule. But I think it's also important to understand that there are places in the world that were not officially colonized by Europeans, and there are places that had their own colonial relationships regionally. It's also important to note that for all the power European colonialism had, it was also fiercely resisted and rejected by colonized people. And the battle is ongoing, and other battles are also more pressing in other places. There are also places within the colonies that have worked out well for a select group of elite rulers who may still resist decolonization. So I think the benefit of learning this materials are when students are informed about colonial histories and ideologies and the ongoing hold they have on our grossly unjust and unequal world, they tend to lead the resistance for against racial, gender, transphobia, class oppression that we've been witnessing. When they unlearn colonial ideologies, students have tended to lead the charge to decolonize all kinds of spaces in which they travel. They do this work with their families, with their clergy members. They do this work with grandmothers, grandparents, peers, and so on. You've seen students who've been exposed to these ideas in Black Lives Matter movements. You've seen them resisting. In the pandemic, they've made a lot of connections about the history of the colonial inequalities and why certain members are predisposed to disruption by the pandemic. So it is very important that this information is actually relayed to students because it activates students as agents of change. How am I doing on time?
You're good. You're good. You can take a couple more minutes.
Okay, and then the other question is about why it's important to decolonize both individually and institutionally. I I think it's important for students to understand these key systems because we exist in a settler colonial context in this country where land was forcibly taken from indigenous people and people were forcibly kidnapped from Africa and enslaved. And unlearning colonial ideology helps us find ways to not be complicit in reproducing violent institutions and instead become decolonizing agents and build a democratizing world. It's also important for colonized people to understand this legacy of colonialism on the psyches of colonized people. Colonialism's violence was not just military, it was also psychological. And we've been systematically trained for centuries to distance ourselves from our own cultural practices wholesale by deeming them backward. And we mostly got this message through what we can call the consent institutions, such as education and religion. So I think it's important for that reason. And I also think it's important to call out our own repressive cultural practices, such as patriarchal traditions that predate Western contact. But we have to make the decision about what we find valuable about our traditions without refracting them through the Western colonial lens, which sees itself as superior to anything that the colonized world has produced. And lastly, for those of us, especially outside of the US, where we have been parts of privileged groups that benefited from colonial hierarchies within the colonized world, I think it's important to know that history so that we actually also can be accountable and we can actually begin to imagine a different world as well. And I can tell you that the term indigenous is not the same within the African context that it is here. Claims of indigeneity have led to genocidal wars where the so-called settlers have been attacked or attacked others and so on. So there are all kinds of ways in which complicity can happen with these colonial systems. So it's important to unlearn all of that stuff. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Villena. Our next panelist is Dr. Tracy Buenavista.
Hi, folks. Thank you, Dr. Villena. I want to thank you for really laying out I think the foundation and the idea that there's different colonial formations. And I think that's something I want folks to sort of hold on to. And I also really appreciate you highlighting how colonialism in its many manifestations, right? We said fiercely resisted, and that's kind of where I want to start. I'm coming to you today. I'm speaking to you as a Pinay professor of Asian American Studies, someone whose family and community's presence in the US is a direct result of American colonization of the Philippines. As a professor of Asian American Studies, one of the things I also want to share with you is October is Filipino American History Month. And a lot of folks don't know that. So I wanted to spend the time that I had sharing a little bit about Filipino American history and experiences, and to show you that decolonization, the thing that so fiercely colonization has fiercely resisted these decolonizing practices. They're not easy, and it's a lifelong process, right? And so I want to share with you one question that guides me through not only my scholarship, but I think my everyday work and everyday way of being, right? And this question is, how can we make sure that our resistance against one form of colonialism does not perpetuate another form of colonialism? And really what I'm asking is, it's really an abolitionist question. When we are harmed, how can we resist or reduce that harm without actually creating more harm, right? Those are really some of the guiding questions I asked myself as a result of learning about colonization and the way that it's manifested in my own community. So I want to share with you some lessons in terms of how I came to learn about colonialism, colonization, etc. And it was really when I was a college student. I know that the majority of folks I see in the room are college students. And so I want to share with you some of the lessons that are foundational in my field of Filipino American studies. And the first thing that you learn in Filipino American studies is that Spain colonized the Philippines for 400 years. That's why you can see someone who looks, quote unquote, Asian American, but they will have a Spanish last name, right? So from 1565 to 1815, Spanish galleons, they crossed the Pacific between the Philippines and Mexico and what's known as the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade. And October 18, 1587, 33 years before the Pilgrims arrived. That's literally how it's shared, right? 33 years before the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth Rock, the first documented presence of Filipinos arrived on Chumash land, or what's now considered Morro Bay, California. These Filipinos were Indios, Luzones, so indigenous Filipinos who were crewmen on the Manila galleon Nuestra Senora de Esperanza, commanded by Captain Unamuno. And their presence is celebrated in Filipino-American studies and Filipino-American studies because they are the first documented evidence of Filipinos being in what's now the United States. But what you should know is that their presence is marked by them attempting to actually occupy that area of Morro Bay for Spain, but were actually prevented and many of them killed by indigenous resistance, Chumash indigenous resistance. Then in Filipino-American studies, what we also learn is that it wasn't until 1763 when the first Filipino immigrants actually settled in the US. These folks were known as the Manila Men. They were literally Filipinos who jumped ship during the Spanish galleon trade and who set up a small fishing village about 30 miles east of New Orleans on Houma land, or what's now known as St. Malo, Louisiana. St. Malo was a village comprised of Houma, the indigenous peoples or original stewards of the land, Maroons, Black folk who escaped enslavement, and the Manila Men. But what's really interesting about St. Malo is that Filipinos are credited, right, with introducing architecture, building housing on stilts. That's a very distinct Philippine architecture, and introducing fishing techniques that ended up making St. Malo one of the largest fishing villages in the area until it was decimated 150 years later by the New Orleans hurricane. Right. So I'm sharing with you some of the lessons that I first learned when I entered Filipino-American studies. But, sort of the undercurrent there is this resistance to colonialism. Right. Spanish colonization ended with the Philippine-American War when Spain illegally sold the Philippines along with Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States for $20 million at the Treaty of Paris. So the US used the Philippines as a military installation. It literally provided access to all of Asia, and military bases were built throughout the Philippines. This is relevant because at the age of 18, my father enlisted in the US Navy in the Philippines. This is a country where more than 80% of the population lives in poverty. Sorry, I think someone has to mute themselves. Thank you. This is where in the Philippines, 80% of the population lives in poverty. So the military is really one of the only few options that offers people financial stability. And so my father ended up in the military for more than 20 years and only retired when the Gulf War began and he did not want to fight, right? I share these stories with you because I want you to know how I came to understand colonialism and how it manifests every day. This is my family. This is actually the last photo that my parents had with my maternal grandparents and my paternal grandparents before they migrated to the Philippines, and we're not able to go back when their set of parents passed away. So I'm sharing these stories because this is how I came to learn about colonialism, how it affects my family, but more specifically, how even when we resist colonialism, we can perpetuate it. So if you took the stories that I just shared, right, Filipino resistance to the colonization of the Philippines are often grounded in settler colonialism, which I know Dr. Blaylock and Dr. Paez will talk about a little bit more. The Morro Bay Filipinos are celebrated for being in the US before the Pilgrims, right? Even if it was their participation in a failed attempt to colonize Chumash land, right? The Louisiana Manila Men escaped the Spanish galleons, but the commemoration of St. Malo obscures the fact that they essentially took over Houma land. And my father was able to resist a life of poverty only through participation in the war machine that is the US military, right? And so all of this to say that decolonization, it's necessary, but how can we do it in such a way that we don't enact some other form of harm onto those we are in relation with, right? And so with that, I will pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Paez.
Thank you, Dr. Buenavista. Sheila, Jose Miguel Paez, Wa Amnishi. Hello, my name is Jose Miguel Paez. It's a real honor to be here with you all. And just want to say, like, this is very exciting to me. I know we're talking about something very violent and destructive. Like energy in this room, and just to follow, just incredible speakers and thinkers about this topic is really, really powerful to me. So I appreciate the space, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'll also share my screen just to start off with a story to kind of talk about this, how we come to this work. And, as everyone's mentioned so far, because we're talking about colonization and the multiple forms of colonization, these are all systems of violence. There's no nonviolent colonization. There's only violent colonization. And it's had a profound impact on structuring our relationships to each other, to our understanding of our names, our languages, our dancing, our joke telling, our storytelling. All of those things are all in relation to these violent forms of colonization. And so to begin this conversation about how I come to this work, I wanted to call forth another incredible, brilliant scholar, also social worker, and a Native woman, Dr. Karina Walters. And I learned this story from reading one of her articles, so I will share it in that way. But she says that, whenever we're talking about historical trauma work, and that's what we're talking about today, is the trauma of and why unlearning, colonial ideology is so important. It's because it's healing. There's a healing component to it. So we always have to start with the goodness, the beauty. I love this idea because when we talk about violence and when we teach this again and again and again, it wears on us. Ask all these teachers what they do after class and what they have to do before class, and the therapy bills we have to all run up, because it is a lot of work, and people who are really invested in doing this work is difficult. So looking for the goodness and the beauty, and so she shares this story that about Cherokee people. And I've kind of titled it in just my head that, and kind of connecting with what Dr. Buenavista said about that question, about posing that question, is maybe looking to our ancestors and what kind of codes that they leave for us, and what kind of codes has the earth and the plants and animals left for us that are all around us towards healing. And so she shares a story that in her article, she says that during Cherokee removal, and a lot of you are probably familiar with what was then known as the Indian Removal Act, the very explicit violence and a logic of elimination towards Native people here in these lands, right? But as they are being forcibly removed, right, Cherokee leaders and their families had the thinking of future generations, and they started to prepare to make sure that those future generations could return. And so what they did was they left these markers on all of the trees. And these markers were in a very coded Cherokee language, and now they're called arborglyphs. But it was to help future generations of Cherokee find their way home and access their familial clan and tribal possessions. And just to think about this for a moment, you're facing, one of the most scariest, terrifying, horrific experiences possible. You're forced, with hardly any clothes, any food. It's almost like a certain death. And you still have the presence of mind to think about a future generation. That to me is much about resistance and resilience and hope that I can summon. And the fact that they have that belief, and that they would use the land around them as an ally, as a co-conspirator. They're like, hey, they will help us. The trees, we are in relation with the trees. They will help to ameliorate this violence so that people can get back. And so just sharing this story, I'm gonna stop sharing here, but just sharing this story, my hope is that as we are talking about this kind of violence, and I'll share a little bit about my story, we can also always think about the things that have been given to us and the things that are around us that help us heal, that help us reconnect, that help us build our relationality. I come from a multiracial family. My mother's family is Mexican and Italian, and my father's family is Filipino and Native. And in that, there's also other racial people and demographics and everything else. But my father was born in the Philippines and migrated here or immigrated here when he was a young child. And we are Siletz Indian. We're enrolled members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz. And so me coming to this conversation around colonization has kind of been always in my life, in a personal way, in a familial way. My great grandmother, she grew up on our reservation in Siletz and was forced to go to a boarding school, the Chemawa boarding school. And maybe some of you are more at boarding schools just in general. They're finding the bodies and the remains of human beings and indigenous people, and children, in these graves all throughout the, Canada, US. And this is not a new phenomenon. This occurs in Australia and New Zealand, and everywhere where colonization has happened and where people work to dislocate those families and harm those families. And so that was the direct thing within our family. And it was also something that my great grandmother never talked about. She didn't share with me her experience about, what it was like to be in a boarding school. And just as Dr. Buenavista just mentioned, the other side of my father's family is from the Philippines, and they endured multiple types of colonization plus war. And so there was all these kind of things that were always involved. And I think a big part of me, becoming a social worker and actually now becoming a teacher has been this purpose to uncover and reveal and reclaim sort of my identity. For many years, I didn't really know how to make sense of what it meant to be a Native person or indigenous person or a Filipino person or Mexican or Italian or any of those identities. And I think the more I've reflected on it, that's the colonial mentality. That is the colonial idea. That's the colonial dream. That's the hope of elimination, is that you will not think about that. You will not think about your ancestors. You will not think about the codes that they have left you. You will not seek the information that has been, or the arboglyph information that has been posted all around you. You just ignore all those things and try to be something else and try to continue in this perpetuating of violence. And so the times and the moments in my life where I've been able to call attention to that and dedicate more time and resource and community to understanding how to disrupt and challenge those ideologies has been very liberating. It's been very difficult and painful, but it's been very liberating. It's been very powerful. It's been very healing, I would say. And so those are some of the things that I think I want to just to highlight. Lastly, in our conversation, as we've been preparing for this, one of the benefits of I think of doing this kind of work is what we talked about as relationality, responsibility, and reciprocity. And but from my reading of it, my experience of it, colonization has interrupted those processes. Colonization keeps us thinking about self above everything else. Colonization keeps us from having to consider or regard other human beings. Colonization loves the gender binary. Colonization loves heteronormativity and ableism and audism. It's a deficit viewpoint that upholds very strict, rigid boundaries around what the human experience can be like. And so this idea of relationality and the idea of reciprocity and seeing the other person, giving to the other person, maintaining and managing and nurturing and sustaining the relationship with people is very, very powerful. And I think that in and of itself can be one of those codes that our ancestors were telling us to continue to utilize. And so, with that, I'll stop here and I'll pass it over to Dr. Blaylock. Thank you.
Wado, Dr. Paez, wado to everybody who's spoken already. Osio all, G'day Liga, Dr. Nicole Blaylock Dakodoa. Hello, everybody. It's very nice to meet you. My name is Dr. Nicole Blaylock, and as was shared at the beginning, I am a descendant of the Crow, Cherokee, and Chickasaw nations, as well as settler Danish and settler English. And So this afternoon, I'm going to kind of slow us back down. I'm going to bring us back around now to CSUN and to campus, and thinking about what all of these relational stories mean, what these colonization stories mean for CSUN. To do that, I'm gonna go back, in my history. My relationality is both historical and contemporary. So, I'm joining you today from specifically Tongva lands. I'm a little bit on the south side of what we currently call Los Angeles County. So even though I am a Native woman, I am still participating in colonization of lands that are not mine, right? Every land across what we currently call the United States has a people, it has a name, it has its own story. And so many of us, like the stories that have been shared already, are displaced peoples, participating in colonization of other original stewards' lands. So to share a little bit of how my family was colonized, on my mother's side, I am a descendant of the Crow Nation, as well as settler English and settler Danish. The Danish side of my family is actually pretty recent. So I'm only the third generation here in the country on the Danish side of my family. But of course, my Crow family has been here much, much longer. But in the case of my grandmother, Mary, she married a white man whose entire family disapproved of the match. And this was, a couple generations back. Interracial couples were still targeted. And so she moved away from her community. So she chose to assimilate into the dominant culture for that family that she was building. And that was a hidden story in my family for a long time. My mother was an adult before it was even spoken about. There was always this family secret that nobody talked about. And eventually, a long time after Grandma Mary had passed on, that was revealed to my mother. So, that's one way that colonization has enacted on this land. So she actually physically removed herself from the community, lost her culture, lost her place that she was. On my father's side, I'm descended from the Cherokee and the Chickasaw. It was already mentioned a little bit about the forced migration of the Cherokee peoples. So, the Cherokee and the Chickasaw come from what is the southeastern portion of the United States. Currently now, the nations reside primarily in Oklahoma. And my grandfather was the youngest child of a very large family because they were rural, they were poor. And his father passed away when he was fairly young. And at that time, because his mother, my great-grandmother, needed support of the older siblings, the siblings that were old enough to help support her once her husband had passed on. She moved with the youngest of her children, including my grandfather, out to California. So once again, because of the system that they were living in, they had to migrate out and leave their land, leave their place that they had been, making their place, even though it was not their original home, Oklahoma, and move out to the West Coast. So wrapped up in all of these practices then become these stories that have been shared today of bodies that have been colonized and that have to participate in this system in different ways, where we invisibilize indigeneity and, have to go through a whole process of our own to relate to the new places that we are in. And it's in healing that relationship, it's in taking on that responsibility, in healing that relationship, where we move forward, and where we move forward in decolonization as, a series of small acts towards, that healing. So I want to just briefly share a couple of images and a short couple of stories of how that invisibilization of Indigenous bodies can play out on a college campus. So give me just a second here. So if we are thinking about American Indian peoples on our campus, it's very, very hard to see them. It's very, very hard to recognize that American Indian peoples are present on campus. There are many projects underway trying to, reach into healing that relationship. But as you can see, so this graph, this bar graph, this is enrollment of American Indian students from about the mid-1990s forward. You see a drop where we go from, hovering around 200 to about 150. That's when the 2004 rules about identification and federal reporting changed. And this is about the time when the way that we began reporting identity really began to mask communities under a couple of categories. One of those categories is Hispanic. We started prioritizing that identity within our numbers. And then the other community that got really affected by that was multiracial. So many of us who have spoken today, we've talked about our multiracial identities. So for me, like if I was a student, I would not exist on this chart, even though I am Native, because I would be put in a completely different multiracial category. So from that point on, you see from that point where we have that initial drop and it moves forward, we just continue to become less and less and less until we are almost gone from campus. And this second image here is actually when you go to try to look at graduation rates for this same pool of students, you can't, because so few of us are graduating that we are now put in a category of other, along with Pacific Islander and probably some other groups. So our students are invisibilized. We can't reach them with the resources that we have, and then they drop out and they disappear. So the invisibilization actually works to push our Native students out of the system. And then the second thing that I just want to talk about real briefly is, another example of this is in how institutions historically have treated Native bodies, and specifically the Native bodies who have passed on. So in 1990, a law passed that required institutions that receive federal funding to document how many Native ancestors and funeral objects were held in their collections from archaeology projects. And so at the time, this is the actual screenshot of that public database. So at that time, 37 MNI, minimum number of individuals. So at least 37 ancestors were held on CSUN's campus, and over 3,500 funeral objects robbed from graves held on campus. So if those 37 individuals are still on campus today, and you go back and you look at those numbers of how many American Indian students we have enrolled on campus today, that number is 35. So there are more dead Indians on campus than live ones under CSUN's own public records. So I kind of just want to return to the fact that these efforts at decolonization and these efforts at acknowledging our colonized selves, these efforts at healing, they're about these small acts that we start talking about. So first we recognize it, we name things so that people know the stories. And then from the stories, we initiate dialogue, which is why we're all here today. And then we think about together and we move forward together in healing that relationship between ourselves, the land that we're on, and between ourselves, the land we're on, and the First Peoples whose land we're on together. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blaylock, and everybody for just getting us to think about these issues in such meaningful ways, and really in really powerful and meaningful ways, and really putting a mirror up to CSUN, right? And how are we implicated in these relationships, colonial relationships of power, and how are we engaging these conversations, and what are we doing? What are our obligations, right, to Indigenous folks in these of these lands, to colonized folks that are part of our that we're part of this community, and so thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I was given this long list of questions, right? But as the conversation was taking place, my mind kept going, and I kind of like, I don't want to use this as self-therapy, but that's kind of where I'm at, right, with the institution. So part of colonial logics is to separate, compartmentalize, including the self, right? We're asked to separate our mind, our bodies, our spirits, right? And then it's all supposed to be separate. In these institutions of higher education, we're taught that in order to make it, right, you have to maintain those separations. You have to, for example, the expectation to maintain professionalism. And so much about that is, a pure rational and not emotional. And when you're having these conversations, especially, what you just shared, Dr. Blaylock, that we have more dead Indigenous bodies on campus than we have Indigenous folks today. Like, how can you remain, right, emotionless to something like that? I often find myself feeling like I'm going mad in these rooms, right? Like if I'm the mad person in the room, and I have to call on certain folks, and some of you on the panel are the folks that I call just to validate what I'm feeling, what I'm going through, right? Abolitionist educator Bettina Love calls these institutions spirit murdering. So how do we resist those efforts to compartmentalize ourselves? And related to that, where does decolonizing fit into your life and into your professional life? I don't know, I just wanted to kind of hear some of your thoughts on that. Do you feel compelled to compartmentalize? And if you resist, how do you resist? And if that's not the question that you want to answer, then I can go to one on the list, but that's kind of where I'm at. How do we engage these spaces that make us feel oftentimes as if there is something wrong with ourselves?
So I know I just got done speaking, but I can start the conversation. So for me, so I'm a professor in American Indian Studies. So, I am really just like in it all the time. I think a few of our other panelists shared that as well. But for me, it's really about this notion that I was sharing at the end of the healing of that relationship. So recognizing how I myself have been colonized through my family's experience, and then thinking about how in this space where I am now contributing to colonization by being a member of, the CSUN community, how I can engage in supporting the sovereignty and the issues that are important to particularly the Tataviam, the Chumash, and the Tongva, whose land we are benefiting, by being a part of the colonization of through our institution. And so that is the way that I bring, my healing into it, because that relationship with the land and that relationship with the peoples of the land is how I am able to help disentangle the settler colonial benefits of being on stolen land in my work.
Thank you so much. Any other folks want to respond?
Oh, go ahead, Tracy. Tracy, you got to push that. I'm anticipating it. Go ahead.
No, you start. Go, Jose.
Well, I don't know. I just could see an arm moving, and I was like, maybe. Well, I think that's such a good question because it's such a normalized process. You know, to be honest, it's very normalized, and I don't always recognize when I'm doing it. And when I don't recognize that I'm doing it, you know, people will, one, either let me know, or two, you know, I will start to realize that I'm out of balance with or out of relation with somebody. Something's not right. And I think that component to this is the way that trauma react, the way that we react, what trauma is. You know, trauma is numbing out. There's a lot of different symptoms of trauma, but one of them is like numbing and like dissociating yourself and disconnecting from things, you know, because to be reminded of the pain is just too much, just too overwhelming. And so that compartmentalization, I think, is a part of that, you know, that maybe in some ways kind of protective, but in other ways, just numbing yourself out to like a statistic and the information that Dr. Blaylock just shared. Like it's just, you know, we just grow up with it. It's normalized violence. And so I think the resistance part of it is being in community with people, even when, you know, it's difficult to do that, and to continue conversating and talking to people, working through ideas. Also checking in with yourself and knowing, like, if you've done something and you've been a part of that complicity, to call attention to where you could be different, and acknowledge that with your peers, with your colleagues, in an open way, you know, where you might have disappointed people or you let people down, or you have been, you know, hidden, you know, done this compartmentalization. And I think it happens with our students too. I see them do it. And it is constantly, to me, like this practice of calling us into community and practicing and enacting a community. And so developing a really clear politics in our classrooms, within our faculty meetings, in our text messaging, and all the stuff that we do, you know, to support each other. I think all of those things are really vital to as resistance, even though they may seem like small things, but they really do contribute to a larger piece of maintaining a connectivity with people.
Thank you, Jose. So I kind of keep going back this doctor and first names, right? Because sorry
It's
about
fine. Yeah,
that. Tracy.
Yeah, I want to echo what Jose just mentioned regarding, like, it's the small things, right? And so I think for myself, that's one of the things that I learned over time, is that because there's different colonial formations or different forms of different ways that colonization or colonialism manifest, right? There's different ways to resist those things. So, you know, one of the questions you asked is, how does decolonization fit into your life? You know, and I think the way that it fits into my life is in two ways. So the way that I learned about decolonization in a Filipino American context, it was always about loving yourself, you know, loving your brown skin, like really kept countering what they call a Filipino colonial mentality, which was like the reverence of whiteness, essentially, right? And so sort of learning about ways to resist colonization or processes of decolonization, in the beginning for me, it was really about, it was ideological. Right. So what do I deem beautiful? You know, how, you know, what are my politics? You know, those sort of things. And then as I started to really engage more specifically with Pacific Islander communities, in Hawaii, more specifically, Filipino Americans, they're, I believe, one of the second largest ethnic group in Hawaii. All right. And what's really interesting there is that Filipinos have such a strong presence in Hawaii. They're politicians, they're educators, they're you know, all kinds of, you know, high-ranking positions, et cetera. And what I realized is that a lot of Filipino Americans engaging in these decolonizing processes in terms of being proud of yourself, where you're from, loving your brown skin, all of those things. At the same time, they were literally like creating policies and practices that were leading to the destruction of indigenous Kanaka Maoli lands, right? Like Native Hawaiian lands. And for me as a Filipino Americanist, that was really hard for me to contend with, right? My people who I looked up to so much were actually engaging in harm against folks who basically, were victims of genocide, right? And so my processes of decolonization on a daily basis shifted for me from not just being ideological in terms of like loving myself, brown skin, et cetera, to now being more about material. How can I participate in land back practices where like I actually am able to materially, right, like return concrete resources back to indigenous communities and just in terms of the things that I do. So I think on a daily basis, the way that gets enacted is through this approach I have, and some of you work with me and anything, right? I'm all about redistribution because colonialism and capitalism are siblings, right? I'll say that colonialism and capitalism are siblings. And what happens is colonialism is all about the accumulation of wealth, right? And so for me to decolonize in a very material way, I'm all about, well, how can I redistribute wealth? Right? How can I redistribute resources? And the way I do that as a professor is I try to get access to all the money that the university has, and I try to actually just give it away. Anything. So you will see me being really, you mentioned earlier, like the Dream Center, the Ethnic Studies Education Pathways Project, the Asian American Studies Pathways Project. We want to, do all these other projects. But all I'm seeing when I'm thinking about doing those projects is how do I get money to students? How do I get money to students? How can I create this project to funnel money to students, right? and their families. And so for me, that literal material redistribution of resources and everything is the way that I try to enact decolonization beyond, the ideological, right? It's funny, and about compartmentalization. I'm on this panel, right? It's all serious. It's all colonization, and my child comes in and gives me this flower, right? And I just thought that that's so ironic that when Martha was asking that question, like, how do we resist compartmentalization? I'm like, this is how, right? Like, my child is here, and it's also my way of enacting decolonization in the sense that he's learning, right? Like he's learning my unlearning, right? All these, for example, binaries, gender binaries, racial, multiracial, we didn't assign them like gender, for a long time. They only more recently, when they started kindergarten, basically decided to adopt a masculine identity. And so I think that's another way that it plays out. Yeah, I'll stop.
No, thank you so much, everyone. And I know I see hands up, and we're going to go to the Q&A fairly right now. But just really quickly, one thing that has been a lot on my mind is how do we make the institution understand the kind of labor necessary to do the work that we need to do for us to be well, right? Like decolonizing is about creating healthy communities. It's about getting us to a better place. And the labor that is necessary, right, to collectively get to a better place is so invisible. So I'm thinking I had this one crisis with the student where I didn't know what to do and I was crying. And the people that I called were Tracy and Jose, right? And then they talked me down from where I was at. And then later on, they scheduled a Zoom check-in with another colleague that I was working with, colleague and friend that I was working with on this issue. And they did this Zoom little therapy session, right? That nobody saw, nobody sees, but that's some of the labor, right? That it takes for us to be well in this space. And so I just want to say to the panelists, right, that I see you and the work that you're doing to get us to that better place, to get to our communities to a healthier place. the kind of communities that our students and that we all deserve, right? So thank you so much for the everyday work that you do to try to get resources to our students, to try to, maintain our sense of self and wellness. And so thank you so much for all of that. Given the time, if it's okay with folks, I'm gonna, unless the panelists have any last thoughts right now, I'll transition over to the Q&A. Yeah.
Martha, can I just say one thing that I think it's important to underscore the fact that a lot of the brunt of this work is being done by faculty of color who carry this work and in fields that are actually the most underfunded by the university, right? So the ethnic studies departments, the gender studies departments, and yet it's probably the most pressing work that we have, not just at the university, but the world at large. And I think that that is something to just constantly underscore that, I think about the biology professor who might not have the imperative to cultivate these extensive communities that are part of the unlearning process, where there are more dead Indians than there are Indians in a biology class. Whereas there is this other imperative of maintaining these communities, investing emotionally, et cetera, that happens on the other end. And I think it just needs institutional support. It's a real dilemma and a paradox. And the university is benefiting from this work, to be honest, on the backs of people who really are overextended.
Yeah, just really quickly, one last comment on that. But right now, there's an effort to rethink safety on campus and really reforming policing on campus, right? In terms of what should policing look like and so forth. And under this frame of safety, how do we collectively define as safety? And for me, that means putting in resources, one, to understand what the problem is, and then to reform the police or whatever. And immediately what came to mind is like, why can't we allocate resources to gender and women's studies, who's done work forever on, because one of the big issues on university campuses is sexual violence, right? And that'll often be the example that's provided to tell us why we need policing on campus. And I'm like, gender and women's studies does so much more work of reducing that form of violence in the world that policing could ever do. And yet that's not where our minds go to, right? So that you just reminded me of one effort that's going on right now to allocate resources to rethinking policing on campus. And I'm like, we should be allocating those resources to departments such as gender and women's studies. If it's okay with folks, I'm going to go to the and some hands were up and now they're down. So sorry if I missed you. If we'll open it up to Q&A. You can comments or questions for the panelists. Please raise your hand and I'll try my best to moderate the discussion. Anybody? I know I had seen Seppi.
Hi, good afternoon. I just have to say a quick word in here in regards to, I have the privilege of being with a fourth grade classroom and also being an adjunct professor at CSUN this semester, my first time. And I just have to make a note with the communities and investing in them and how important it is starting from even the smaller ones, because I think that's where the seed is grown. And I think what Tracy also was stating was once we have that installed in our students, I think then as a matter of fact, as it progresses throughout the years, then we'll probably see less of all the things that we're noticing now, and as opposed to trying to fix it down the line. So there's one thing that I do know LA Unified has put into place, which is the restorative justice, the building that community circle, and the effectiveness of what it really does have on an overall level on our students is huge. And I just love that my student teachers and everyone else has access to that in order to be able to use those community circles to reach out for their emotional and social problems that they're having, especially after coming back after these challenging times. So I just had to make a quick note of that and not take too much of your time.
No, Seppi, thank you so much. That's the point, right? For us to engage and see the work that people are doing. I don't know if the panelists have any thoughts on what Seppi just mentioned, especially in terms of restorative justice and thinking of different ways of engaging each other than the punitive model that we've had, right? Okay, I'm being the teacher. I'm waiting 10 seconds and then I'll move on.
Well, I'll say something. I just want to hear other people's comments and questions. That's why I don't want to hear myself talk. But, aligned with what you're talking about, Seppi, is also, the governor just signed, ethnic studies as a graduation requirement for all students in California. At the K through 12 level. So if y'all didn't know about that, right? And so I think aligned with, sort of restorative or transformative justice techniques in schools is also going to be the mass introduction of ethnic studies in the K through 12. But aligned with that, one of the ways that I think colonialism plays a role is in the implementation process, and how even with restorative justice circles, that's really an appropriation of indigenous community practices, right? A lot of people do not know about. So that's one. But with regards to ethnic studies, I'm so glad it's going to reach all of our students. But what we're also seeing is the watering down of what ethnic studies education provides, including attacks on even using words like decolonization, in the curriculum, and how it's going to be really difficult to actually implement a quote unquote, for lack of a better term, authentic ethnic studies education at that level, right? And having people who have never taken ethnic studies tell educators what ethnic studies is, it is just another, again, colonial formation.
Thank you, Tracy. Seppi, if you don't mind me asking, what department are you teaching in?
Early education department. And I just actually, to go on basically what Tracy was saying, I think just the fact that I have this voice to be able to link together that gap. I'm Persian. My husband is half Black, half Persian. So my kids are mixed. And then when I was at CSUN, I did do my core in African American culture, just because I knew that going down this avenue, how important it is to reach our students with the diversity, and how important it is, exactly like what Tracy was saying, how it really is downplayed. And once you realize where your students are from and their background, it's truly unique to understand where they're coming from, so that you can make that connection. It's not a behavior problem. You just have to make that connection. And I think that's just one message, if I can always just say to anyone, just making that connection with these young students that are coming through. And I always say we got to give them credit for even smiling, being on campus, going everything that they're going through. So yes, the early education department, absolutely. And I'm just so thrilled and honored to even be a part of this today. And I just don't want to take any more of your time, but I think it's so important to value that background knowledge in all of our students, no matter what grade level.
Thank you so much, Seppi. Emily Permanova, I know you had your hand raised for a while. Go ahead.
Yes, well, I teach in the communication studies department, and that makes me very fortunate, because I am able to find ways of encouraging people who are from varied backgrounds and have families that come from different issues. I'm from Washington, D.C., and consequently, I grew up loving having diversity in my life. And I moved to Portland for a short time and taught there in a college, and I had one person who was Black in the class. That was it. No one else. And we actually had to live in a very small area that actually did have diversity, because I refused to have my kids brought up without diverse friends. And what I discovered during this pandemic, doing online teaching, the students in my classes, because I'm lucky enough to be teaching speech classes quite a lot, and they need to give speeches about, informational speech or whatever. And what I've discovered is that the students, when they're online, are very open to share who they are and what's going on with them, especially if it has to do with the fact that they're not white, right? And it's delightful. It's just so moving, and I'm so delighted. However, I'm thinking back to when I was actually teaching in the classroom, which I guess I'm going to have to do in the spring. And I didn't get that much of that. They didn't seem to feel as free, but somehow online, they feel much freer to be really open about challenges that they have because of their race, their sexuality, their whatever. So it's been delightful for me. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Any of the moderators thinking about how students engage differently in different settings and possibly why that may be the case?
Mhm.
Well, real quick, going based on what Emily was just saying, we just had this discussion in regards to growing up. How I don't even think I had a Black teacher or any other, I want to say, diversity, just going through my elementary, middle school, and even, I believe, high school. So I really see your point on that, Emily, on so many levels, because it's so important, especially for the connection. And I always say I was the ESL learner who came and I just couldn't speak a word of English. And I always would say, I wish there was someone somewhere that would have been able to guide me. I don't even think I would. I couldn't even say, can I use the bathroom, obviously, using the English language. So I think that's just where, and I love this panel for that reason, to bring those key terms up.
Thank you. I know, Santiago.
And if I could just add something, it's not just racial issues. The best student that I have ever had was autistic, and seriously autistic. But he was fabulous, and he and I became really pretty close, still keep in touch. So we as professors need to really be very sensitive to the fact that people are capable of doing amazing stuff if we give them the ability to do that and to give them support for that.
And that goes back to colonial thinking, right? The construction of binaries, and not just that binaries, right? Normal versus abnormal, but that some are given value and that means devaluing of others. So how do we undo colonial thinking? But I know Santiago Bernal, you've had your hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you for this space. This is definitely a needed space, so I appreciate it. I want to say thank you. I wanted to ask you about how to decolonize office politics, policies, and practices that we do on a daily basis that are so inherent in colonialism, hierarchies, capitalism, and so on. So I know you could say they were all siblings, and I also want to put racism in there. I don't know if it's a sibling, cousin, or what it is, but somewhere in there. But I struggle with that. And by the way, I'm spying from UCLA, so thank you for having me here.
Thank you for coming, Santiago. Any of the panelists want to respond? How do you decolonize the office space? I think that was the question.
Well, I don't know how you decolonize it per se, but I think that it's a really important question because it is, it's an outcome, that kind of a toxic space is the outcome of really being in a really colonial and neoliberal university context. That's very hierarchical, that's very bottom down, that's very centralized in ways that are very top down. It's very difficult to address even in progressive spaces like gender studies or ethnic studies, you still would have the office politics permeate. So I think that's a really big institutional question. This is, and I think that you're right. I mean, I think there's a lot of more discussion about decolonizing classroom spaces or faculty hiring practices, but what happens at the staff level, that seems to be sort of this invisible thing that we don't pay attention to all that much. But I mean, I think it's a big question. I'm not sure how you do it. I've just been kind of stunned at how that that relationship that we critique in our fields reproduces itself in our departments, and it just kind of takes your breath away, you know. Just confirming the challenge and the bigness of the question, I guess.
Thank you, Tina. I know one of our staff members in our department, I won't get her in trouble, hopefully, but she's like, Marta, you all faculty have your degrees, but you have no common sense. And so it's like these ideas, right? Like that value that if you have a certain title or a certain degree, we value it more. And so that needs to be interrupted and complicated, right? And I work with students and student interns, and I'm like, always, whatever the staff, right? One, pay attention to whatever the staff tells you, right? Because they're telling you for a reason. I'm like, but they're the ones that make things happen on campus, right? They're the ones that make things run or not, right? They have more power than you think, I tell them. So thank you, Santiago. Other folks on that question, how do we decolonize the relationships in these spaces, right?
I wanted to maybe just briefly extend on what's been said already. You know, yeah, it's a big question, and you know, there's no one thing that's the answer. But at the same time, we can start being really reflective back on ourselves with things like, you know, looking around the room. What voices are represented in the room? Are there vulnerable voices that are missing from the room? Particularly if you're looking at like one particular issue or something, right? So thinking about who's in the room and ensuring that there's just visibility and opportunity to have those dialogues in ways that don't put the ones who are vulnerable in danger, so that they can be open and can have an open conversation about things that are happening or things that they are experiencing, or share their ideas, because it's from the communities who are experiencing the traumas that you're going to get your results, right? Because it's going to look different for everybody. It's going to look different for every context. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to, say like, oh, here's the one answer that's going to solve it for all of us, because it's going to be so specific to, where we are, where our institution is in its own healing, and how much those spaces are willing to open up and really listen and reflect on other voices.
Yeah, I appreciate what's been said, and I think the other part of it, or one of the part for me is it's already happening. I think Dr. Escobar already shared, like what Gender Women's Studies has done, or just look at what Dr. Escobar is doing. Just follow anything that she's doing, or anyone on this panel and what they're doing. Those are already efforts to decolonize, and they're already doing that work. And sometimes it's just not noted and regarded. I think that there's this idea of like indigenizing and also decolonizing, these kind of simultaneous processes, so that, because obviously there's moments where we have to dismantle things or disrupt things or not have those policies anymore and bring something else. But as that work is also going on, I think simultaneously there can be work of acknowledging and bringing in representation, all those other kind of things, building relations, just in our day-to-day interactions with people. I'm just listening to the comments, and I'm kind of struck by the fact that despite everything that we're sharing, Dr. Blaylock mentioned this really remarkable statistic, about, and framed it in a very powerful way, that there's more remains of Indigenous people on campus than there is actual students on campus. That would be something to contend with, as a university. What does that mean for our university, that we are holding those remains here? And whose family members do we hold? And where should they be going? Who should we need to contact? There should be like an outcry for that, But because as Dr. Escobar mentioned, I was a basketball coach. So my mentality is always like about practice. And I think because we tend to practice, these very colonial ideologies, just like Dr. Beignet was mentioning, is the fact that, I'm sorry if I said your name wrong. I think I just said your name incorrectly. But just like that, these systems that we critique still get replicated. And then to me, again, it's just the practice. This is what we do. We normalize those kind of things, So the unpracticing, the new practicing something different requires a whole different type of discipline. Not even really a motivation, just a discipline to do what you don't want to do and have to keep doing that again, being really, really uncomfortable with it. So that's some of my thinking on that.
Actually, I've just asked Santiago, can you say a little bit more about what the experience has been like for doing this work at the staff level, administrative level?
No, of course, yeah, sure. I think for us, and I want to recognize Dr. Dimple Jan from the Education Department. She brought to us, while she was a graduate student here, to our Center for Community College Partnerships, she brought critical race theory to our work. And through that, I think it allowed us to have a vocabulary about all these systems of oppression that we have been, of course, in our work, fighting against and attacking and dismantling and et cetera. So I think because of that, we, of course, we can point always out to what's going on outside of us and that we can see wrong. It is harder to look inward and to say we are perpetuating those same systems that we're fighting. I'll tell you very explicitly in our office, we have 9 folks who work in our office of full-time staff, and the 2 people who are at the top, me as the assistant director and my director, are Latino males, right? In of itself, it's already, there's an imbalance, and most of the rest are women who are working. So there's an imbalance already in there, right? So being able to critique that, not criticize it, critique it in a way that is constructive, in a way that is going to result in real, changes, can be very difficult for those of us who are in those places of privilege and power, right? And to try to dismantle that, or to try to find ways in which we can change that, has to be, it's labor intensive, it's emotional intensive, and it requires to look at other models, but sometimes those models don't exist, and we have to think about how do we create those from when the university itself is insisting that we have those models. Right? So that's where I think we're at this point, where we're trying to look at how can we do things differently so that we're not replicating, duplicating, and modeling that same type of behavior with our student staff, with the participants in our programs at the community colleges, so on and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Santiago. I am being mindful of time. We do have a short video that we want to close the event with. I think that the question that you asked and the fact that you're coming from a position of leadership within your office means that you're doing that important, engaging in the important work of self-reflexivity, right? That you are questioning, why does this space look this way and how can we create it, make it different? So you're already starting to do some of that work, and you're connected to Dr. Dimple Jane, so you're in good hands. She's amazing, and she's one of the folks that should be part of this panel, right? Doing the work at CSUN with us. So thank you. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the organizers. We're going to turn it over to Ayan, and thank you so much for the invitation and for being here.
Great. I am going to go ahead and play a quick spoken word video. Our artist today is Jessa Cardone. Jessa's supposed to be joining us, but is in Apache Reservation today in Arizona, so doesn't have a networks, but she sends her regards, and she kindly sent us a video for us to watch. So I'm gonna go ahead and share.
We can't hear it on our end. Ayan.
This with an open heart, an open mind, and hope.
Can you hear it now?
Yes.
Sorry.
Hello, relatives. My name is Jessica Calderon. I am Tongva Chumash as well as Ueme, and I would love to share a poem that I wrote with you all. I hope that you listen to this with an open heart, an open mind, and hopefully receive something good from it. I'm going to read it as I have not memorized it, so bear with me. You are stupid. You are ugly. You are useless. You are disgusting. Imagine being told this as a child every day of your life. Imagine being beat or raped as a child so often that your body grows numb. Imagine believing your whole life that you are unlovable, worthless, and dumb. Now you're grown and looking for love since you were kidnapped. You never had it. Feeling broken, you don't know how to shift out of the anger and sadness. You have children and they feel your cold interior. Like the colonizer who hurt you, you make them feel inferior. Your kids learned they were native, but they couldn't tell anyone. They felt alone. They never knew they were on their traditional territory. They never felt at home. They felt extremely out of place. Signs on the shop window sills not welcoming their color and race. School mistreating them and teaching them lies. The self-hatred is strong. It is felt in the one who gives it life. The same way genetic trauma was passed down through the native generations with broken treaties, as was white privilege to the invasive species. University student, business owner, CEO, etc. These were positions our relatives didn't feel worthy of finding themselves in. We were conditioned to believe we were meant for cheap labor and jail. Heal the trauma, speak your truth, know your worth, stand in your power. These are the actions that cause you to prevail. We are the generation that our uncles and aunties have fought for. The smoke has gone up, the tobacco placed down. Your spirit knows your journey. No one can stop you now. Awesh Koneha, thank you so much. I ask Creator to guide you on your journey and to help you to understand and look within and really know that you are sacred, you are beautiful, you are worthy of everything good in this life, that you are loved, that you are lovable, that you are loved. Sending you all so much love and gratitude. Awesh Koneha, thank you.
All right. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you again for our wonderful panelists, for our wonderful moderator, Dr. Marta Escobar, our wonderful panelists, Dr. Tracy Buenavista, Dr. Tina Bayene, Dr. Jose Paez, and Dr. Nicole Blaylock for this wonderful space and sharing all these resources with us and educational tips and history, your own stories, as well as just really guiding us through this space today. We really appreciate it. Again, this program, it's a collaboration program with University Student Union, USU Dream Center, the Asian American Studies Pathway Project, American Indian Studies, Civil Discourse and Social Change, Department of Social Work, Doctoral Program in Educational Leadership, Ethnic Studies, Educational Pathways, Mentoring to Overcome Struggles and Inspire Courage, Project Rebound, as well as We Are Power, Community in Action and Conference. So we thank you all so much. Check out the resources and amazing centers, organizations that help put this program together. Check out the work of our wonderful panelists. And lastly, I just want to thank our amazing staff, Dwayne Johnson and Alejandro Jimenez, who are not here currently, but made this program possible. And our acting assistant director, Audrey Martinez, who was just here. So thank you all so much for all your work that you have done and for joining us and spending time with us and continuing your educational experience or continuing your educational journey in helping for our culture, our world to become a more decolonized and moving towards an anti-racism framework. CSUN and our folks that joined from different campuses doing the same for your campuses. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.